Let's talk Trek. If you've come here before watching the episode, you've only yourself to blame if you hear something you'd rather not have heard. Don't be a dingleberry about it. There's a good reason I'm front-loading that spoiler warning. We'll get there in a second. Now, in the season capper of Strange New Worlds, we get a kind of what-if story. What if Pike avoids his tragic fate and is still captain of the Enterprise in the events that Kirk originally faced as the Romulans tested the strength of resolve of the Federation? Turns out the answer is whoops. And it was a very strong season capper too, left me very happy. And I'm front-loading that spoiler warning because I want to start at the very end of this episode. Because finally, some go-around comeuppance for number one's bullshit, lying and skeevy deceptions. I've mentioned this before in one of my reviews of, well, a few of my reviews of Star Trek Strange New Worlds actually, but the instant it was revealed that Una was an illegally and artificially genetically augmented person, she should have been stripped of rank and held answerable for her lies and deceptions that her whole career as a Starfleet officer has been based upon. I come back to one of my favourite Picard quotes for this, and I will spare you any attempt to emulate Patrick Stewart's accent or elocution, but the first duty of every Starfleet officer is to the truth. Whether it's scientific truth, or historical truth, or personal truth, it is the guiding principle on which Starfleet is based. And if you can't find it within yourself to stand up and tell the truth, you don't deserve to wear that uniform. Una, of course, is revealed to be a genetic augment back in episode 3, Ghosts of Valyria, and augments in the Federation and in Starfleet are in direct violation of Federation laws, themselves inherited from pre-Federation days from one of the most devastatingly violent and oppressive eras in human history, the Eugenic Wars. So I found Una's lack of personal integrity in this matter pretty offensive, not to mention how willing Pike was to cover it all up just because he liked her. I consider it a character flaw on both their parts when this thing happened. Now, that said, when I first approached this issue, I had a few commenters suggest that they too entered our very own real-world armed forces while having to lie about who they really were, in this case, their sexuality. And fair enough, I see the point, I see that parallel. If they didn't lie, they couldn't have served, and if they didn't serve, then they couldn't stand as later examples, or prove just how stupid it is to prevent someone from serving in the military just because their romantic lives are homosexual instead of heterosexual. Dumb, always has been dumb. And if they had used Una as any kind of tool for exploring that within the show, addressed it in any way, used it as a storyline, as an allegory, as a metaphor, I can absolutely see a reason to keep her around to tell that story. It could have been a powerful story, and maybe they're going to take that path in season 2 when she's incarcerated. Maybe they're going to explore that then, you know? Is it really fair to exclude her just because of, well, something she is? Except in the Federation's case, there's a very good reasoning why augments are banned. Because superior ability breeds superior ambition, and that's kind of a dark path. But letting it ride like they did, without addressing it at all, making Pike complicit in her lies and deceptions, and her taking no personal responsibility for her own actions, and just letting Pike cover it up, shows us a tremendous lack of integrity. And that's my problem with her. And it's not the only example I've raised of her lack of integrity, but this most egregious example, it should have been addressed immediately, or at least in the next episode. And finally, at the final episode, it was addressed. So seeing her ask get hauled off at the end of this episode to finally answer for her deceptions and lies and dishonesty, I found that extremely satisfying. Very satisfying. Hello again, I am Blunty, and with that said, let's move on to the rest of episode 10, the final episode, the season capper for Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 1. A Quality of Mercy is the title, and at the end of last week's review I had placed my hopes in this episode to return to form. After 2 of the previous 9 episodes in the run left me deeply wanting, and as the season is so short to begin with, 2 large misses from a 10-episode run meant 80% of season 1 would be unwatchably crap from my perspective. That was pretty disappointing. That's mathematically significant. And indeed, in this episode, they nailed the landing. Not a perfect 10, but damn near close enough to leave a pleasant aftertaste for the whole season in general. thumbs up on that. So we open on a quick overview of the existential horror of Pike's impending future. Previously on Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Pike's all, crap. And I was glad to see this in the setup. I was really hoping they weren't going to just leave this hanging over the whole series run. And this episode did a good job at moving Pike along and the processing of the trauma that is yet to come. And doing it with actual storytelling instead of how Discovery would have done it. In a series of extremely dull and awkwardly worded, unnaturally expositionally weighted dialogue scenes that in no way reflect how real people actually talk to each other. And this too I've spoken of at length. I'll link a video in the down below where the largest portion of it deconstructs the journey that Pike is on regarding his impending severe injuries and the disabilities it will leave him with, and how it's an extremely believable path of trauma for him, rather than being sort of ableism, as some people have suggested the show's treatment of this is, and him seeing it as a huge disaster, a life-ending disaster. It's awful to be crippled. Oh no, that's not ableism, that's the path. Please watch the video in the down below. It makes it much more clear than I can here. So in the cold open, we're brought to the neutral zone with a little exposition for those new to the franchise, detailing an overview of what and why the neutral zone even is to begin with. And if you are new, just know that this is something that weaves throughout the entire life of Trek, from the original series, TNG, DS9, and even oddly enough, despite them being 70,000 light years away from it, even in Voyager in one episode. Decent episode too. But mostly this episode dances atop the structure of one of the most beloved original series episodes, Balance of Terror, Season 1, Episode 14. 14? 13. One or the other. Someone correct me. That's a trap for those of you who know what I'm getting at there. And it is, of course, an episode we've spoken about before in a previous review of this season of Star Trek. So, Pike's Enterprise is on the way to the border of the neutral zone to help re-equip and resupply the outposts that line and monitor and help patrol the border to make sure everything's still chill over there. It's all pretty routine until Pike, in a feat of mathematical improbability, happens to be introduced to a child who just so happens to be one of the Starfleet cadets that will die in the incident that he himself is fated to be severely and irreparably injured in about 7 years' time from the perspective of that moment. The kid is all thrilled and excited about joining Starfleet, having adventures, and meeting the famous captain of the Enterprise, Christopher Pike, his role model. And understandably, Pike is super freaked out by this. It's not like he can just be all like, hey kid, look, I touched a time crystal at a Klingon monastery a while back, and I saw you get melted to death in a pool of searing radiation, so maybe don't dream too hard about fantastic space adventures in a nice, clean, probably red uniform. I do as the crystal guides. So he smoke bombs out of the room, a little more exposition in a corridor walk with Una, and to his quarters where he can have a nice quiet anxiety attack, and decides to gently discourage the kid and all the other cadets injured or killed in his fated future from donning the uniform in the first place, and thus changing all of their fates. Hopefully, fingers crossed. But he's having trouble finding the right words to explain this to someone who really, really wants to be in Starfleet. And then a time-hopping version of himself pops in, clad in what the fandom referred to as the Monster Maroon uniform, a Wrath of Khan era uniform. Not one of my favourite uniforms, but given the reaction to my video about uniforms in general, it's the favourite of many of you out there, so I'm sure you were happy to see it. So future Pike is all, yeah, you're going to figure out how to say what you need to say, no worries about that. These kids will be fine, but maybe don't do that, because if you do, you're going to wreck the future almost as bad as a boomer in the 1980s ignoring client scientists for the following 4 decades. Too political for Star Trek? But Future Pike goes on. He's like, I know this is a tough sell. You're used to all kinds of sci-fi shenanigans, so here's something you already trust to show you the future. More time crystals. Remember how much fun you had the last time you touched one of these? Touch it again. Touch it. Touch my time crystal. Oh, and please don't ask how I got it. You know how pissy those Klingon time monks get about these things. I'm not proud of the favors I had to do to get them to let me take this instead of coming back here themselves and bisecting you with a freshly sharpened batleth, as they do, those Klingons. So, present Pike goes on a Ghost of Christmas future ride and sees the path best not taken. So we jump years ahead, post where the accident should have happened. He's avoided getting himself melted and a bunch of cadets killed and injured, so he's still captain of the Enterprise. And he's arrived at a flashpoint in Federation history. Something's blowing the absolute crap out of their neutral zone outposts with a kooky new weapon. It's probably the mysterious Romulans. I mean, there's no proof, but, you know, come on. We all know it's the Romulans, don't we? We all know it's them, those Romulans. Oh, and we also meet a later version of Spock. This one even closer to the Spock we know, colder, more suppressed, less expressively human. And this Spock, to time-travelling Pike's mild surprise, is his first officer, not Una. The exposition of which is super weird because Spock himself identifies himself as number one over the comms, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm damn near certain he has never once used that designation for himself, nor has any other number one for that matter. Not even Riker refers to himself as number one. But it was fast exposition, lazy and weird-sounding exposition, but fast, so fine, whatever, we can blast past it nice and quick. The rest of the episode plays out over that what-if version of Balance of Terror, and it rather interestingly makes the point that Pike, who many of us might see as a superior captain to Kirk, thanks to his flair for charismatic diplomacy, his thoughtfulness and care in decision-making, a man who weighs up options before reaching a conclusion and making a decision, a man who listens to other people, compared to Kirk's often more guttural, instinctive and posturingly aggressive style of command, his so-called cowboy diplomacy. But in the original episode, Kirk's more aggressive, albeit tempered by guile and cunning style, actually results in a better long-term outcome. From the perspective of the Federation, at least, probably not so much for the Romulans, and specifically against a foe with the Romulans' cultural disposition towards conflict. And it's a fascinating angle to take about all this, especially after they go to such great pains and in oddly paced efforts to really hammer home that even Kirk's own brother, currently serving aboard the Enterprise, thinks that he's an impulsive, unpredictable nutbar with a heavy penchant for bucking at any authority that isn't his own, a man who will break rules whenever it suits him, and often just because there is a rule to be broken in the first place, and who mostly survives and in fact prospers on blind searing luck more than talent, insight or skill. His brother, by the way, 60-year-old spoilers, also fated to die in the not too distant future relative to himself here, but for those of you who have been continually confused by the mustache Kirk, or have left comments saying that Jim Kirk shouldn't be on the Enterprise yet, it's a continuity error, Kirk shouldn't be there. Do you get it now? Do you understand now? It's not Jim, it's his brother, who was in the original series, by the way. Do you get it yet, you dopes? Do you feel foolish yet? Because you should. And props to the production, by the way, who claimed in a press release and in photos that they had cast this young Jim Kirk for season 2 of Strange New Worlds, all as magician's patter, so we weren't sitting around all season long waiting for him to finally show up on screen in season 1, only to BAM! Hit us with Jimmy Jim Bob James friggin' Tiberius Kirk right here in the last episode of season 1. Nicely done. Perfect. Certainly works better than JJ's idiot bullshit of the, oh, it's not Khan. I pinky swear, I promise, it's not Khan. Oh, it's Khan. Oh, gotcha. What a twist. Gotcha. Tricked you. No, you didn't, JJ. Not a single one of us was fooled by that. Can you fuck off now? So, surprise Jim Kirk. Only it's not really a Jim Kirk I recognize. With the movie reboots back in 2009, Chris Pine's Kirk was a new Kirk, but still felt familiar. It wasn't an impression of well-known jackass and shitty person William Shatner's original Kirk, but there was enough there in attitude, in stance, in the way he sat in a chair. He had Kirk-like swagger and arrogance. It was still Kirk. It was a different Kirk, but it was still definitely Kirk. This Kirk, I can't see James Kirk here. It could have been any captain with a more aggressive leaning than Pike, really, in the situation. It was only Kirk because it kind of made sense thematically for it to be him, considering the conflict at hand and the contrast of how this near-identical setup was dealt with by original series Kirk in Balance of Terror. But on screen, I mean, it was fine. It was a fine performance, it was a good performance, and as entertaining, as engaging as any classic series that had two officers similarly butting heads over command styles and tactics, save perhaps the exquisitely wonderful clash of Riker and Jellicoe in Chain of Command, which also gave us the smuggest Riker to ever smug a smug. And I don't know about you, but every time I rewatch that episode, I warmed to Jellicoe a little more. I hated Jellicoe. We were supposed to hate Jellicoe at first, but you rewatch that episode again and again, you went, hang on a sec, Jellicoe's actually doing the right thing, and Riker is being a bit of a dickhead. And look, yes, I know, this is a new interpretation of Kirk. A Kirk without Enterprise, without Spock to temper him. Much like this Spock is a younger and slightly different take on Spock, but he's still Spock. He's still instantly recognizable as Spock. But this Kirk, there was no Kirkness about him to me. I detected not a shadow of the Kirk we know in either of the versions we've seen on screens. There was just something missing, a charisma, a swagger that just wasn't there. So I await to see if Season 2 brings this into crisper profile, but it was the only big thing to let me down about this episode. We keep being told this is Kirk, and I just didn't recognize him, and that conflict was very distracting to my viewing experience. So, the episode continues to play out as Pike, in absolute earnest belief that ending this conflict in peace and in good faith, in opening a door to hope, in offering a hand of friendship, does anything and everything he can to stop things escalating. And this is, in fact, the way it should be done to avoid the terrible future he was promised would happen. He thinks by letting things escalate, the terrible future was promised will come to pass. Which, of course, is in stark contrast to how TOS Kirk handled things in the situation, meeting the Romulan captain on his own footing, in contest, will against will, mind against mind, aggression meets aggression, and battlefield cunningness, not diplomacy. I loved the updated look of the Romulan uniforms, by the way, and their bridge set for that matter, instantly evocative of the classics without looking quite as cheesy as the originals did. Even the Centurion's helmets didn't look goofy anymore. I was at first surprised that they kept them in the first place, and then surprised they actually made them look good. Mostly by hiding them in shadows, but still. Oh, and remember in the very first review of the very first episode, I remarked on how the general approach to cinematography worked to keep the feel of how the original series was shot, but without letting itself be limited by the large and heavy and awkward equipment and limited technology that forced TOS to be shot a certain way because, well, there was no other option. And remember how I mentioned that they were missing the eye bar that you will never ever unsee once you start noticing it because it's extremely present in the original series? Well, it's back. A bit more subtle, with softer edges to make it less distracting and weird looking, but it's there. And it's there through the entire episode. Very nice touch. Well done, I thought. Subtle touch. I'd expect many probably won't notice, especially those who are newer to Trek or aren't as familiar with the original series as some. But nice. Also worth respecting all the little nods and twists and references specific to the original episode, which this is sort of overlaid on. The Romulan's parting speech, most obviously, perhaps. I regret that we meet in this way. You and I are of a kind. In a different reality, I could have called you friend. Which has always been my favourite version of the adversary, we aren't so different, you and I, speech trope. Well, that one and the wildly scene-chewing Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin version of it, which is probably the best there's ever been. Oh my god. How much would you love Willem Dafoe playing a Romulan commander? Holy shit, he'd be perfect. He's got the right face for it and everything. He's got that jawline, those what do you call those lines that come from the corner of your mouth? Those things that, you know, all the classic Romulans have. Willem Dafoe has to play a Romulan at some point. He's so perfect. It'd be amazing. Anyway, I was also a bit shocked to not hear the Romulan commander respond to his subordinates' warnings and challenges of his actions with, Danger and I are old companions. A classic if cheesy lines, another one I love. But we did get a twist on the, we are creatures of duty, Captain. I have lived my life by it. Just one more duty to perform. Classic. The skill of all this is weaving those lines and references in organically without forcing it, just for nostalgia bait or a big old squeeze of member berries. And they got away with it, I think. Nothing in this, when they did that, felt weird or forced or oddly placed. I also like things like this shot of Spock. Familiar, right? We also hear Scotty's voice over this shot. Nice touch. There's other things too. In the original series, there's a moment after the Romulans made visual contact, or are visually revealed at least, and the revelation is that they look very much like Vulcans. A slow pan across the shocked faces, the slack jaws of the bridge crew as they all turn to Spock. One of the bridge crew makes a snide remark under his breath, meant to imply that Spock was perhaps a spy of some kind. He shouldn't be trusted because he looks like the enemy. And Kirk takes him to task over this, forcing him to repeat what he just said under his iron, and then dresses him down, commanding him to leave any bigotry in your quarters. There is no room for it on the bridge. Beautiful line. Wonderful. And in this version, there's a very similar moment. There's the reveal, nearly identical, the realization of the whole bridge slowly turning to Spock over a very classical music scoring, heavy on the brass. The camera zooms in on Spock to his reaction of a single eyebrow cocking in curiosity. It was beautifully done, wonderful. It felt right. And on that note, there was a lot of musical foreshadowing of this moment too. The whole conflict to this point was underscored by a classic but much more subtle horns in the music bed. Very, very evocative of classic Trek's music, but again, without feeling too forced. For those in the know, we certainly would have noticed it, and for those who didn't, it'll pass by to you and not feel weird and out of place. And then, in a couple of follow-up scenes, we have Ortegas vocalizing a guttural distrust of Spock, which felt very out of character for her. But this is a future version of her, so maybe shit's been building up on her for a while and this is her breaking point. I don't know. It really does feel out of place to have her play the role of suspicious, vocal, angry, distrustful bigot, though. La'an would have been a much more natural fit, but in this future she's already on a different ship doing other things, so the writers just shoved it in Ortegas' lap, I guess. It happens. Remember when Khan inexplicably remembered a certain Russian that he shouldn't have remembered? But the moment for Pike and Ortegas is moved deeper in the show than Kirk's and Star's was, and was much more aggressive and sudden than Kirk's. But it also feels quite natural, even for Pike. Ortegas keeps pushing and pushing, getting more and more aggressive, and Pike, feeling the full weight of the moment and knowing the fate of the entire Federation may sit at his every decision, snaps at her calls for more aggressive footing, first ordering her and then barking at her to stand down. A break in Pike's usually flawless equanimity that really nails the moment, I think. And this is why I love characters like Pike, and why I'm deeply enjoying Anson Mount's portrayal of Pike. When they do reach a point of explosive tension release, it means something real. It's not inherent volatility of the character, it's the cracks forming at their edges. The conflict continues patiently but relentlessly, much like the previous episode in the season, inspired by, albeit a little less directly, by Balance of Terror itself. The pacing is just right to slowly build the tension and do so relentlessly, and we all know a turning point is coming. We just have to get there, and Pike knows it too. We see him continually anticipating it. What will be his fatal decision? Where will he go so catastrophically wrong that he'll feel the need to beg Time Lord Klingons to let him go back in time to try and rectify it? And that's just it. It's not one point, it's not one decision in this conflict. It's a culmination. It's not what he does or how he does it, it's who he is as a man, as a leader. It's not his fault. It's not something he did wrong specifically. It's just he's not the right tool for this job. It was never about one moment, not on this day. It was about the choice he made near a decade prior. He tried to cheat, to avoid something he was told, in no uncertainty, is and should be utterly unavoidable. The Klingon monks told him this. They said, once you know this, can't be changed. Your decision. But Pike let guilt and fear and shame light his path, and it wasn't even out of selfishness. Who could even blame him for trying to find a way to save a bunch of these cadets? Wouldn't you? Janeway certainly would. Sisko would. Picard might. Riker sure as hell would, without a thought. And it's an interesting irony that in being someone he isn't, someone who cheats, he winds up in a place where a man who is notorious for cheating should have been in his stead. It's Kirk's solution to the Romulan threat that is the desirable future for the Federation. Kirk, a man whose most notorious feat in Starfleet Academy was cheating to win a test that was designed to be a no-win scenario. It was intended to be a no-win scenario. It was an evaluation of character and a lesson about learning from failure and how sometimes there is just no way to win. It's a test of personal constitution in the face of crushing defeat. And Kirk just cheated. Kirk cheated. He doesn't believe in no-win scenarios. So arrogant is he that he truly believes at his core there's nothing that he cannot conquer, even if he has to do it dishonestly. And that attitude, well, it goes for women as well, really. That's a bit problematic under today's lens, but Kirk cheats a lot. He's clever, he's cunning, he's deceptive. He will lie and cheat and fool and bluff and do them as easily as you or I might breathe. And it's right about now you're thinking about my opening, about how the first duty of an officer, about my attitude toward Una. And you're right. But here's a question for you. Motivation. What is Kirk's motivation for cheating, even lying with bluffs? And what is Una's motivation for her lies and deceptions? Because that is the difference in my eyes. That is why I will tolerate Kirk's arrogance and deceptive nature and will not tolerate Una's. I still have a huge problem with liars and lying, but I can understand why Kirk does it. It's not out of selfishness. Una's was. And these are all things in Kirk that do not come naturally to the earnest, honest, and sincere Pike. Oh, Pike can and will manipulate, like we saw him, triggering a mutiny among the pirates in an earlier episode. Wonderful. But that's not the same as how Kirk will cheat a situation. Kirk will also reach for a sword more easily than Pike will, which is why Pike's solution to the Romulans failed. Had he understood Romulan culture better, he'd undoubtedly have won out. He's a natural diplomat. We've seen that before in how he dealt with the reflectively empathic diplomats in a previous episode. He understood them, and in doing so, he met them on their own ground and succeeded where no other officer did, where no other diplomat did. And if he had the right tools at hand, there's no doubt he'd know just how to handle the Romulan commander here. But Pike needs that knowledge. He needs to consider, or as one of my own little personal mottos goes, to think, then do. Kirk, though? Kirk was just lucky. Right man in the right place with the right attitude at the right time. A cunning man, sure, no doubt, cunning, whose tactics and ability to predict his enemy won him the day. But he did so from gut, not in knowing the Romulans, not in consideration, but in hunch. He got lucky. It's an interesting thing to ponder. On paper, I bet a lot of people would more easily rely on Pike to de-escalate a conflict than Kirk. And peaceful relations is an absolute core concept at the very foundation of the Federation, which makes Pike a better captain. But this time, specifically, right here, right now, that attitude leads to disaster, slaughter, war, because this enemy sees a hand of friendship as weakness. Mercy is a flaw, empathy as fragility, and respect is only won with a weapon in your hands and an unshakable commitment to violently use it in the belief that every act of brutality and force is an act of strength. And thus, all of that makes this a fantastic episode of Star Trek. Not only was it a fantastically enjoyable story centered around character, not spectacle, but it has that classic Trek mix of sci-fi and philosophy. A mix that makes Trek what Trek is, at least what it should be in a lot of people's opinions, certainly mine. And as the episode climaxes, we do see classic Kirk tactical decisions, trickery and bluffs as he brings in a bunch of automatic mining vessels to pass off as an armada of warships. Saber rattling. Very, very Kirk. But again, this Kirk doesn't feel like Kirk in any other way on screen in the way he presents. That certainly was a very Kirk decision, though. And then we wrap. The chips have all fallen. The Romulans call the bluff, because of course they do, they're Romulans. The results of Pike being in that position are made final and clear to him. In his attempts to cheat fate, to save his cadets, and in extension himself, many, many others pay the price, a much steeper price. Specifically, Spock most immediately of all, a man whose future as a diplomat is essential to a lasting and meaningful peace with the Romulans. A man the Romulans can understand, a Vulcan who is not Vulcan, a Vulcan who understands the emotive drives in a way no other Vulcan can or will, a man who is already of two worlds, who will lead the way to bridge two more worlds. We see the seeds of this in places like the Next Gen Season 5 two-parter episodes, episodes 7 and 8, Unification. Well, kind of a lasting piece, because, Star Trek Picard gave that a nice little kick in the scrot, didn't it? Point is, Spock being Spock, strolling around doing Spocky things in Spocky ways instead of being a brain-damaged lump of meat is kind of important for the Federation's future, as we know it at least, for a lot of reasons. And Pike is made to see that, and it helps him accept his fate, knowing that his friend has such a bright future, a future that he can help him get to. It's enough for Pike. He's humble enough to understand this, and it's a no-win scenario. His life will effectively end in pain and violence and misery, and he will live in pain for the rest of his life. He will watch as young people under his care will suffer and die. This is his Kobayashi Maru, and he will not cheat it. This glimpse also shows Pike that Kirk, despite his arrogance and general tendency towards being a bit of a jackass with no respect for authority, is also someone worth looking out for. And I'm expecting in Season 2 we'll see Pike trying to sand down some of Kirk's rougher edges and try to make him a more balanced leader, not just in the face of terror. See what I did? Okay, that one felt a bit forced. I'm not proud of that one, but, you know, had to try. And also, of course, in this action, Pike will also be the path that seeds the friendship between Kirk and Spock themselves. It's a good episode, a very good episode of Star Trek, a worthy season capper, and manages to leave us hungrily anticipating Season 2 without pulling the old dick move of a large, obnoxious cliffhanger. I mean, yes, there's the Una incarceration thing, but I don't see that as a cliffhanger so much as I do a resolution of something they started in Episode 3. It's someone finally getting the comeuppance they deserve for being a lying shit stain who should not be in that uniform. But the season's over now, so the question is, what do I do now? For 10 weeks now, I've been making these reviews. They were better received than I'd ever expected, so I want to keep doing stuff like this now, but what do I do next? Go do some retro episode retrospectives? Find a new show to do reviews like this? I don't know. Guess we'll see. Shrug. Thanks for watching. Overall, a very good season. Mathematically, a bit lopsided because it is only 10 episodes, and a few of those episodes were kind of duds for me, but started strong, ended strong, got a bit wibbly in the middle, but what do you need? Thanks for watching. I am Blunty. Live long and prosper, and thanks as always to the patrons scrolling up above there.